We are continuing on with Jesus' 8 woes to the Pharisees. We will not finish them today. But then again, is anybody surprised by that? They are found in Matthew chapter 23, verses 13 through 33. We're going to read that text, put it back into a context, and then move a couple more down the road with it. So Matthew chapter 23, starting with verse 13. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people. For you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore, you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that's nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Therefore, whoever swears by the altar, swears both by the altar and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple, swears both by the temple and by him who dwells within it. And whoever swears by heaven, swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, who strain out a gnat, and you swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup of the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the dish, so that the outside of it may become clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside full of dead men's bones and all uncleanliness. So you too outwardly appear righteous to men, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tomb of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Father God, we would ask that in the next 30 minutes that you would help us to realize that this isn't just a warning to the Pharisees, but that this is something that we need to take stock of our own lives, that we need to make sure that we are not the issue that keeps people from finding you, and that we are very diligent about being what we should be, so that we don't get caught up in just a system or in some religious observance, but that we really are dedicated to you, and that our heart is with you, and magnifying your kingdom, not building our own. And in your name we ask. Amen. So this is in the context again of the Passion Week. This is Jesus on an intentional march to the cross. He knows it's coming, and it won't be shortly after this that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are Sadducees, and the scribes are all going to get together and just, okay, we're done with it. And this is kind of that last gauntlet where Jesus has drawn the dividing line pretty squarely. This follows on the 4 questions where Jesus puts all of his opponents to the point where they just can't argue with him anymore, in which they realize, okay, this debate goes poorly for us. Trying to discredit him isn't working, so as they begin to walk off, Jesus then gives them these woes. And then what comes after this is Jesus will lament over Israel. Jerusalem specifically, and then he will talk about his second return, which is interesting and probably somewhat confusing for the people who are looking at him going, but you haven't left yet. But we'll cover that as we get there. But my goal is to at least get to the halfway mark of these 8 woes. And again, woe is not just simply, now it's a term that we use when we're doing equestrian things, when we're riding horses. We're just wanting the horse to stop. But in actual usage in Bible, it is the strongest warning and the strongest condemnation kind of possible. And as we look at the language that Jesus is using here, there is nothing less than blunt and nothing less than really harsh. This is not Jesus sugarcoating anything. There is a time and a place to just be blunt and to lay it on the table. And while I'm not sure that I'll say it this way. It's directed to the Pharisees, but it's also a warning for those who are standing around. Because again, when we look back on Scripture, we clearly think, well, the Pharisees, they're clearly not the good guys. They're clearly not the religious elite. They're clearly not people who understood the Scriptures. But the problem is that the people who were in Jesus' day, that's how they thought of the Pharisees. They were the people who had it all together. They were the people who lived good lives. They were the good people. They were respected pillars of society that everybody thought well of. So then, when Jesus is warning people, that's not what you should be. You should be more like these 12 ruffians that I've got following me. There's this weird, wait a minute, why is it that way? So Jesus is going through, and I'm sure it's not an exhaustive list, but he is walking through, why is it that there is a woe? Why is there a condemnation coming to the Pharisees? And last week we looked at the fact that they were not just hypocrites, that they were play actors. That's what the word means. Again, it comes from Greek. And it comes from those people who you could do a 20-person play with about 3 or 4 people, which was kind of normal. You would just even sometimes do whole scenes by yourself. You would hold up the first mask, you would say your lines, and then when you want to switch to the second character, you would just simply take the mask down and put the next one. And then you would say your lines and move on. And they were used to watching people do this. They were used to watching one person actually talk to themselves with 3 or 4 different masks. So you can see that naturally then would carry over to somebody that you're trying to say, well, you're intentionally being false. And it is the intentionality that is being called into question. I hear a lot of times that, and I hear it from Christians, well, the church is just full of hypocrites, and everybody goes, oh, yes, we're all just hypocrites because, we try, but we just don't get there. Okay, that's not a hypocrite. That's somebody who tries and doesn't get there. It's different than when you intentionally, to use an 80s term, when you're fronting, when you're intentionally trying to get people to see you as something that you know you're not. If I tried to convince you that I was an all-star tennis player, then that would be me being a hypocrite. I like the game of tennis. I can halfway play the game of tennis, but I guarantee you if we went out on the court, most of you would be able to keep up with me. And I recognize to whom I speak. I enjoy it, and I know how to hit the ball, but we're clearly not going to the Olympics. It's just, so if I attempted to front that, then you would find out really quick. And there are several leaders in churches who I think that this would be good for. However, hypocrite again is somebody who is intentionally being misleading about who they are. The Pharisees know that they don't care anything about the kingdom of God. They understand that what they want is people to notice them. This is why they keep people out of the actual kingdom. Because when it's about you, it's not about God. So this is what's meant by they actually block the road. They actually block the door, if you will. They are intentionally, much like you get in the way when you have like a 1-year-old, for example, and you want them to go somewhere other than in the cabinet, you stand in front of the cabinet. Or you stand in front of the bathroom door so they can't get to the toilet that for some reason every child wants to play with. I don't get this, and if somebody can explain it to me, it'd be really helpful, because then I could take whatever the fun part is away, and then I could let my daughter roam the house again. But in the process, I watch her. I don't just let her in a free-range child. It's just, anyways, let's back to seriousness. But in the process, well, that's going to go poorly. I just realized, okay, hold on. You'll appreciate this later. I left my watch sitting down there, and that was going to go bad. Because let's face it, I have no internal clock. I don't even normally use that one. But anyways, in the process, here are those guys who were intentionally trying to make it about themselves. They knew it. They came up with their rules to benefit themselves, and that's how they played that. They also took from those people, devouring the widows' houses, and they were intentionally taking resources and intentionally taking from people who were just gullible. People who had no advocate, that there was going to be no repercussion from, and they would do it under the pretense of, oh, yes, I will give you a blessing now, and here you go. And then they would go off with whatever they wanted. That was who Jesus is talking to. So then, verse 15, picking up, but I would also like to point out when I do that, that verse 14 ends with, you're going to receive a greater condemnation. This is not in the sense of they're in level 6 of hell, whereas, just semi-bad people are only in level 2. That's not, the notion is that they are going to get God's ire in a very much more pronounced way. Which, when we look over in the next couple of chapters, what you will see is Jesus predicts the destruction of Jerusalem. That is part of, though I'm sure not all of, the greater condemnation that's coming. People who are religious leaders, people who should know better and choose not to, receive much more of God's ire than the, shall we say, heathen who know nothing. Amen. There are those people who grow up and will never hear about Jesus Christ. While they are still held accountable and will still go to hell, which should spur us on to missions in an even greater capacity, they are not under the same great condemnation as those who have sat in church all of their lives and just don't care, or who have pretended that they cared. There is a huge difference and a huge gap, even if you look back through the scriptures, of how God interacts with those two groups. But then that brings us to verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. This is an interesting condemnation. And there's a couple of ways in which we can understand it. And I'll give you both in case you want to disagree with me. But one is that these is a statement by Jesus that the Pharisees are actually going on missionary journeys, much like Paul will go on a missionary journey later on. And as they get to Ethiopia, as they get to Ephesus, as they get to wherever it is that they go, that they are actually then converting those people to Jews, to Judaism, and bringing them back. That is a possible interpretation of this, but I think it is actually more so I can't say the word now all of a sudden. Anyways, this is a figure of speech that Jesus is using. I'll just go Porky Pig and go that route. And that it's not hyperbole. It shouldn't have been that hard. But I have a different word in my head, and that was the problem. Now that okay, anyways, nobody cares. So as a figure of speech, I think this is more you go to great lengths to get people to follow you. And the reason that I don't think that the Pharisees are actually traveling around the world sharing what they thought was the gospel, or more so just spreading Judaism and calling people to themselves, is because they don't even eat with people who are outsiders. They won't associate because that's part of being one of the good guys and being the righteous ones, which is what the Pharisees called themselves, by the way. We are the righteous ones, which makes some of Jesus' statements of, rather than one of these righteous ones, okay, there's a little bit of irony in how he says these things. Jesus actually has some really funny zingers that are just there, and one of them we'll look at in the next set of these. But in this particular phrase, I think it is much more so that Jesus is saying, you guys go to great lengths to get people to follow you. I mean, you cover all the land and sea and air. Okay, so sorry, that one slipped in a little bit because they can't fly. I get it. But he's saying, you go to all of this length to make disciples. You've got a lot of effort here. And that's the irony. And it's the irony that still exists for the church today. Those people who know the truth don't share it so much. Those people who have the wrong gospel share it like it's nothing. They're just handing it out like it's candy. Think about how many times has a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon knocked on your door? A lot more frequently than somebody who had the actual gospel. Most of the people who are evangelizing have it wrong. Amen. That's part of our issue. That's part of why the world thinks that we're fruits. And not in the good fruit. But in the sense of a nut. That's part of that why. Because we're not sharing the actual gospel. We're not really giving, this is what Christ did for you. And this is why you needed him to do that for you. We don't share very often. We don't share very well. It is not their evangelistic zeal that Jesus is condemning here. It's what they're sharing that is being condemned. It's the fact that they're recruiting people to themselves, which is what most of the cults, most of the false religions, and most of the wonky Christian sects are doing. They are building a kingdom to themselves. Most of, and actually all of, the cults that I am aware of that have sprung up with a, quote, Messiah figure, playing off of people's misunderstandings of Scripture, start with people getting really dogmatic about sharing what they know. So it is not that this is an anti-evangelism statement by Jesus. Because then the end of this book makes no sense. Instead, this is a take stock of what you're sharing. If we go, and I've watched this happen even with people, if your intention in evangelism and sharing even the correct gospel is to get points for yourself, you're doing it wrong. If it is so that you can then talk about how often and how many and how, the vast numbers of people that you share with, so that you can then check your scorecard and turn it in. We used to have, growing up, and they were on the offering envelopes, and they were on the Sunday school things. It was always like, how many people did you share with? Well, I get the point of that was an accountability, and it was a spurring each other on thing, but very quickly, at least in my neck of the woods, where cultural Christianity ran rampant, it very quickly got into a scorecard. It very quickly turned into I'll share more than you did. Well, okay, so there's probably some benefit still in that because the gospel is going out. But this is what's being condemned, is I want the focus on me. And we know people who use the gospel for themselves all the time. We hear people who talk about, this is how great my God is. And by the way, I'm the way in which you get, no, Jesus is the way in which you get there. But that's part of what's here. But I really want to emphasize some of the back end here. So they get a convert or a proselyte, depending on how your translation wants to use the word. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. The word hell here is actually the word Gehenna, which most translations, if not all, on a routine basis, at least at some point, will translate the word Gehenna as hell. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. There are actually, I can't remember if it's 3 or 4. Some things I think I should have written down. But there are 3 or 4 words that we actually translate over as hell. Gehenna is one of those words that is legitimately a picture of, but it is meant to pull some imagery. So we're going to take a really quick, and the only way I can do this quick is to not take you to all of the Old Testament passages that I want to do this with. But a quick, here's what Gehenna was. In the time of Jesus, it's this side spot outside the walls of Jerusalem where the trash is burnt, where refuse, your sewers go, and where all of the things which are nasty, unclean, and it's the dump in a very real way. If you were to take a landfill, a dump, and a cemetery for criminals, thieves, all of the unliked people, and all of the carcasses, like if you just drove up the interstate and you went, oh, well, there's some roadkill, we better get that out of the system. This is where it goes. And because all of that is out there, it's constantly on fire. As things break down, methane releases. So there's constantly this smoky, smoldering thing. But on top of that, or underneath that rather, I didn't think about that. I could have made a much cleverer wordplay. Gehenna comes to be that because of, back in the Old Testament, some of the people decide they want to start worshiping Moloch, which is horrendously a bad idea. In order to worship Moloch, Moloch is built, he is a statue, and he holds his hands like this, and his hands make a slide. This is one of the ways in which you do child sacrifice. It is in the valley of Gehenna, or in the valley of Gehenna, that this takes place. So as you sacrifice your child, and there is no so I'm sorry for the image here. What you would do is you would heat up, you would build a fire in the actual idol itself, and then you would slide your baby in. And it was passing through the arms of Moloch. That's what that phrase means. So it's not just killing your baby. It is the manner in which that is done, which is even that much more. Okay, that's horrible and horrendous, but you've just taken horrendous to a new level. And you can imagine the vileness that Israel has to associate with that. So what happens is when the revival occurs on top of, they just bulldoze it down. But it's such a tainted place. It would be like trying to do something with Auschwitz or any of the other concentration camps. What do you do with that? Mm-hmm. Well, you're not going to build a summer home. There's nothing that happens with that. So you just leave it as a memorial of this was horrendous. And you remember horrendousness because of that. The Germans were intentional. Now there's just a parking lot over Hitler's bunker because they refused to build anything there because we're not going to in any way. This is now such a non-existent place. The same thing is what Israel does. They're just like, well, this is already a horrible, unclean as you can get spot. So what we're going to do is we're just going to throw everything unclean in here, and we're just going to chalk it up to a lost set of borders. So that's where you threw all of the things that make things unclean. From your sewer, again, to your trash, and it's just always smoky, it's always on fire, it's always, you can imagine the smell that's coming out of that. I mean, this is always a no man's land. No self-respecting Jew is ever going to even encroach upon its borders. That's the picture that's used. It's not a statement of, well, that's where you're actually going. It's see how horrendous and vile that is? That's what you are. It's meant to evoke I'm not, I don't in any way associate with that. But that's what you are, because you're unclean, and that's where unclean goes. That's why it's used as a picture of hell. And there's a lot of debate that goes back and forth about how some of these things are used. But just in simplistic terms, what's being said here is you make them twice as unclean as yourself. Because now, you get somebody who goes a little bit off. Because if you go way far off the gospel, people don't come with you. So you just take a step off to the side. I'll stand over here just a little off center, and I'll know that I'm off center, and I'm okay with that. I don't want to make people uncomfortable, so I won't tell them they're sinners. And then the next generation is like, well, we don't even want to tell them they're bad. And then till pretty soon they're so far over that way that they don't even recognize the sinner as being the actual center and truth. That's what we find in our own culture. That's part of the tendency here, is that every time we allow things which are wrong to go unchallenged, and there's a way of challenging and there's a way of being a jerk when you challenge. I get it. I'm not giving you license to be jerks. But I am saying truth has to find its voice through us. We can't allow ourselves to drift off center. We cannot allow ourselves to be the people who begin to move let's define Christianity as being over here. And then allowing somebody else to define it over here. And then we've got to keep it at center. The next part of this, which is actually the longest woe, because Jesus is going to go on somewhat, rant's probably the wrong word, but he's going to go on a little bit. But verse 16 picks up, you blind guides. This isn't the first time Jesus has used that. And it's on one hand, kind of a funny picture for us. You can imagine somebody who can't see where they're going trying to lead people who don't know where they're going. It's an absurd picture. But that's what Jesus is saying, is you don't understand where you're going. You don't have any clue where you're going. You're an idiot. And you're trying to lead people somewhere that you've never been yourself. You can't lead people to holiness if you refuse to become holy. You can't lead people to righteousness if you're not right. That's Jesus' point in that. So he then goes on to talk about how they have this system, and that a lot of trees have died in vain to try and explain the origin of the system, and most of those trees disagree with each other. So I'm just going to be real honest, I'm not entirely sure why one thing is sacred and the other thing is not, when they're, like the altar and the sacrifice on the altar. It seems to me that you're just splitting hairs, but that's the point. And what has developed in Jesus' day is they had if I swear by this, then I have to keep it. But if I swear by this, it sounds like I'm swearing by something that's significant and holy, but I don't actually have to keep it. We call this double talk. We call this, verbal sleight of hand, which is kind of funny. It should be sleight of mouth, but whatever. But in the process where we say things that we know people are going to take wrong, and take wrong in our favor. So for instance, because this came up, I wasn't going to use the example, but now I can't resist it. When I was growing up, I dated a girl who I wanted to date for the first year we were dating. And after that, not so much. But trying to break up with her was really a difficult task. We can talk about that later. But my parents would sometimes answer the phone for me because of the way. And they would do this. Notice their eyes were shut. Nope, sorry, I don't see him. It's called lying. Let's just call it duck and duck. But what is being gotten at is my parents were saying things that they knew were going to be heard as, well, he's not here. But they were intentionally being true, but misleading and true. That's just how that works. And there are other less extreme examples of that we have all the time. where I didn't technically say that. Well, that's not what I actually said. What I actually, you just misunderstood me. But we knew full well that when we said whatever that was, that it was going to get misunderstood. And that's why we phrased it that way. We wanted people to kind of allow our phraseology to go unchallenged. And we could think of example after example, but this is what they were doing. The Pharisees would make a promise on something that they didn't care about, that didn't matter, that didn't really have any heft. God can't take away his temple, and you can't really take it if I'm wrong. So, I'll make an oath on the gold of the temple. What are you going to do? You going to go take a hammer and a chisel and take it off? Good luck on that. That was kind of, one of the commentaries thinks that was the attitude. But ultimately what Jesus is getting at is your double talk, your promise with no intention to follow through, your intentional lying, your intentional deception in the guise of being religious and super religious. I mean, because you can imagine even just making, if you're the average Joe and you hear, well, I swear on the temple. Oh, well, he must be telling the truth. He's willing to lay his hand on the Bible and tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth. We think about that and then we're like, oh, well, wait a minute. He just lied. And that's what Jesus is getting at is that they have a system and a built-in system where they know they're double talk. So one Pharisee can't say this to another Pharisee because the Pharisees are in on it. But they know this is really just double talk. And they understand, and they're ignored at. There was, I probably shouldn't dabble here, but I'm going to because, why not? And I'll figure out why not while I do it. But not too long ago, there was the conservative resurgence, or the conservative takeover, depending on which side of the fence you're on. I'm going to call it the resurgent because I'm on that side of the fence. And I think it was a good thing. I think if you're going to teach the Bible, you should believe the Bible. But the people who were in a lot of our academic institutions as Southern Baptist, all of your seminaries, not just Midwestern, and a lot of your colleges, which we're still filtering down through the colleges, by the way. But in the process, they learned how to say things so that people thought they believed in the inerrancy of Scripture. So that they thought that they believed the Bible. So that they thought that everything they said was center and correct. But instead, when you sat down in their class, Genesis, that's a myth. He was a great guy. But certainly you don't think he actually died, do you? And there was all kinds of really odd stuff, but they learned how to double talk. And that's what Jesus is calling the Pharisees on. The Pharisees have now started to take God so lightly that they plan their lies. They've created a system in how they lie and get away with it. It's just blatant deception. And it's planned and okay deception. That's what this amounts to. That's what this looks like. And that's its point. But he then goes on to make this point as he ends in verse 21 and 22. And whoever swears by the temple swears both by the temple and by him who dwells in it, or dwells within it. And what Jesus is getting to is anything in this temple that you're swearing by, that you're using as a pledge, actually ultimately is you're swearing on God. You're swearing on the Holy One. You're swearing on the one who is the creator of the universe. You're swearing on the one who is supposedly your God. That's the one that it all actually comes back to. Verse 22, and whoever swears by heaven swears both by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. This is Jesus' main point here is you keep by making oaths that you don't intend to keep, you're actually reflecting that God is a God of falsehood. you're actually slandering his name. When you say, I'm telling you the truth, and you can be assured of it because I'm just going to make some token pledge over here that I don't intend to keep. Ultimately, what you're saying is, it doesn't matter to God if I lie, because God himself lies. That's the reflection, and why Jesus is coming at such a hard 90-mile-an-hour fastball at their head. This is what that is geared at. It's what it's geared for. It's meant to make them go, well, I can't call God a liar. You're right, so stop doing it. And when we as Christians say, thus says the Lord, we better make sure, A, that he said it. I mean, there is a real tendency to find things and to just run with them that are tradition or that they are something other than thus saith the Lord. But we need to make sure that as we live our lives, because again, I don't want to just look and say, well, this is Jesus talking to the Pharisees. Boy, I'm glad I'm not one of them. I hope you're not one of them. I hope I'm not one of them. But the way in which we make sure that we're not one of them is we take stock of passages like this and not just go through rock, through rock, through rock, through rock, through rock, but we take and evaluate. Do I smear the name of God by how I live? Do I ever put a black mark on God's reputation? Do I feel convicted when I do that? Because it's one thing, and I understand you and I, we're all sinners. I get that. We're being sanctified, and hopefully we're less sinners today than we were yesterday, and especially 10 years ago. But in that process, when you sin, when you do something that is a smear on God's name and a smear on God's character, since you represent God, does it bother you? Because it didn't bother the Pharisees. I mean, they would do it and plan that they were going to do it. This is, as the Old Testament says it, an intentional sin. The Old Testament does actually differentiate between those sins which are accidental and those which are intentional. And has harsher punishments for those things that you do, knowing full well that you're about to go do them. So that if you plan on how to cheat on your wife, there's a harsher penalty than if you just stumble into it. Like you haven't thought about, okay, we're going to make a rendezvous, which is a weird word, but anyway. If you're planning that versus, like there's differences. Still sin, still going to be punished, still not okay, ever. And it's not just that one, but that one just is the easiest to kind of make the point. Whereas the Pharisees here, it's not just that they got into a spot and out of their mouth came a lie. It's that they've thought about it and said, here's a system we can use so that the general populace will know when we're being deceptive. And they slept well. Do you sleep well when you know that you've done something wrong? If you do sleep well, if you can sin and lay your head down on your pillow and it not be bothersome to you, then you're probably more like the Pharisees than you want to admit to. And at that point, it's a really good point to take stock and say, I don't want to be that guy. Or gal, depending. But the notion here is that they had created a system in which dishonesty was encouraged and okayed. They had justified those things which were evil as being good, or at least being acceptable. And we have to make very careful stock that we don't do that. We need to be very intentional that we're not the thing that keeps people from God. Amen. We need to make very much sure that it's about His kingdom, not ours. Amen. Father God, we thank you.